Quick introductions then to James and myself. So I'm Hamish Trench and Chief Executive at the Scottish Land Commission. I lead the staff team. We have a small staff team of around 18 staff that are based largely in our office in Inverness. James, over to you.
Yep, I'm James. I'm Policy and Practice Lead at the Commission, one of three. My areas of work circulate around various different things, but particularly for tonight, we'll be focusing on the Land Reform Bill, a bit of the history of how we got there and kind of our involvement to date. So.
Great, and it's I mean, it is important to us at the Commission that we are open and accessible, and so tonight is one opportunity to hear a bit more about what we do, but also to ask us any questions that you have about our work. The Land Links seminar series, this is the first in a series of webinars over the next few weeks, and the aim really is to share information about key aspects of land reform, mostly about supporting good practice and helping people find out information. We'll provide a bit more information at the end of the webinar about some of the other sessions coming up. Tonight's webinar is very much an introduction that will provide some context on where land reform is now, a bit about the Commission's current work, a bit about the current land reform bill that's going through Parliament, and setting the scene for some of the more practically focused sessions to come over the next few weeks. Next slide, please, James. What we'll cover tonight is a look, first of all, at where we are in land reform, what's changing in law and policy as well as practice. We'll introduce what the Commission does to support good practice and land rights responsibilities. We'll take a brief look at the Scottish Government's land reform bill that's currently going through the first stage of the parliamentary process. And we'll look at some of the other areas of work that we're focused on in the Commission and some of the wider challenges that land reform is seeking to address. But James and I don't want to speak at you certainly for 45 minutes tonight, so we plan to speak for around about 20 minutes and make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. Next slide, please, James. So we've scoped to tailor this as we go, so please do let us know in the chat function if there's particular things that you want to hear more about, and we'll do our best to cover those. We've plenty of time for questions. As I say, after James and I have introduced things with some slides, the rest of the session will be available for questions and discussion on issues that we've raised or other topics you'd like to ask about. When the time comes, please do just use the hand function if you'd like to speak, or feel free to add questions in the chat function as we go, and we'll keep track of those as best we can. Okay, next slide. We'll start with just a look at the timeline of where we are now in Scotland's land reform journey, as it's often called. Good, of course, start back in the 1800s, but I think really Scotland's current land reform journey starts with the devolution in 1999, when Donald Dewar in the Scottish Parliament set out to make reforms that, as he put it, would stand the test of time. And since then, of course, we've seen a series of both legislative powers and acts coming forward, but also a number of other changes over the 25 years now since 1999. Those reforms first took shape, of course, in the 2003 Land Reform Act, which introduced the community right to buy and the crofting community right to buy. And that really established a big focus for land reform in Scotland on community land ownership. Those rights to buy were further developed in the 2015 Act, the Community Empowerment Act, which introduced the right to buy abandoned, neglected and detrimental land. And further again, the 2016 Act, which introduced another right to buy on sustainable development. That Act in 2016, of course, also established the Scottish Land Commission, which began to operate in 2017, with the remit to review and advise on changes to law and policy and practice. And then bringing us right up to date, of course, over the last couple of years, the Scottish Government has consulted on another land reform bill, and that bill is now in Parliament from spring this year, going through the first stage of the process, and we'll say a bit more about that later in the webinar. Next slide, please. Over that time, of course, we've seen quite a lot of changes, not just in terms of the acts, the bills that have come forward through Parliament, but more widely. In terms of law and policy, we've seen the community ownership and rights to buy become very well established. Community ownership is now an absolutely normal part of the pattern of land ownership in Scotland, and one that has been normalised significantly over that period. We've also seen, of course, a new land rights responsibility statement coming from the 2016 Act. This is a statement that's really quite important. It's a statement that's agreed by Parliament. that sets out some key principles for the relationship between land and people in Scotland. It's a potentially powerful framework, really based on the human rights framework, but also it's a very practical reference point that starts to shape our management practice. It's certainly something that we use in framing good practice expectations in terms of land rights responsibilities. So those are two of the big changes that we've seen over the last few years through previous land reform bills. We now, of course, have a new bill in Parliament that brings a slightly different focus on regulating large land holdings, and we'll talk a bit more about some of the key measures that we're seeing in that. Next slide, James. But of course, it's not just the law and policy aspects that change. Over this last few years, we've seen significant wider changes in context, of course, which land reform needs to respond to, and which influences how land reform is delivered. Not least, of course, we see Scotland's ambitious climate and nature goals that are shaping land policy and decisions more and more. In fact, those goals are actually shaping the motivations for people and organisations wanting to buy and own land in Scotland. Some of that is changing, and the work that we do each year looking at the rural land market shows, for example, the influence of emerging natural capital value as one example, and keeping track of the trends and the influence that that has in terms of people looking to buy land, but also its influence in the way that land is valued. And in part related to that, we've certainly seen a fast-moving and high-priced land market in recent years. Some of the peak prices may be passing by now, but there's no question that demand for Scottish land remains very high. A lot of people looking to buy and wanting to own land in Scotland, but a relatively small supply of land comes to the market in any given year. What we have seen, I think, over the last few years is a really positive shift in the focus on community engagement across land ownership sectors. Many landowners now view this as a normal part of responsible land ownership, and it's certainly an area that we provide regular advice on to landowners, to land managers, to communities, and I think it's one of the aspects that has seen a real cultural shift over the last 5 years, and a good signal that things do change in practice. But of course, if land reform is driven in part by a desire to reduce the concentration of the pattern of land ownership in Scotland, we need to be alive to the fact that there are signs that, if anything, that pattern of ownership is becoming more concentrated, not least in relation to the forestry and farming sectors. So despite the ambition for a more diverse pattern of ownership, there clearly remain some challenges there. So some of those fundamental goals for land reform set out back in 1999 are still highly relevant. But of course, the way we approach this is evolving as the ambitions for Scotland's land changes and evolves over the years. James, next slide, please. One of the key aspects, as well as providing advice on law and policy, one of the key areas of work that the Land Commission focuses on is supporting good practice. We have a team that works with landowners, communities and others to help put into practice Scotland's land rights and responsibilities principles. And this is really about providing practical guidance and advice on how to do things well, essentially. We've published a series of protocols that set out practical expectations for responsible practice, and these cover a wide range of topics, from community engagement and transparency, through to practical ways to diversify ownership, respond to requests for sale or leases, and through to responsible approaches to managing natural capital value. We support these with guidance and advice and case studies that are all available on our website, as well as proactive training opportunities, working particularly with professional advisors as well as landowners and communities. Next slide, James. And our good practice team is always happy to hear from people in terms of experience on the ground. We will help where we can, but it's also important that we hear from others about what works and what doesn't work on the ground. And I'd emphasise that this is not just about rural land. Our good practice programme supports practice across both rural and urban Scotland. And we have a casework system and are always open to hearing from people with examples of both good and poor practice. If people contact us, for example, with a concern about a particular case, we will always seek to offer advice if we can that help both parties find the resolution. So please be aware and feel free to make contact with the Land Commission team on that. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to James to give a bit of an overview of the current land reform bill that's going through Parliament. James.
Thanks, Hamish. Yeah, so this will be probably a bit of a whirlwind, given time constraints and the volume of things we could talk about related to the bill. But I thought I'd start tonight with just a brief update or kind of potted history of how we got here in one slide. So people familiar with the land reform debate in Scotland will know that scale and concentration in land ownership had been and has been an issue of great debate for a long time. One of the first pieces of work the Commission did, certainly after it was founded, was to look at this directly and uncovered a number of different issues, largely stemming from issues of power and control rather than scale of ownership per se. And our research suggested this has quite good parallels with monopoly policy in other parts of the economy. So again, if you think of a large landowner that may control a lot of land, but also perhaps a lot of the private rental accommodation in a village, perhaps also own the village shop and the pub, and you start to see how one person or entity can exercise quite a lot of control over the lives of that community. So this poses a risk to the lives of the community, but also to the local economy as well. And that really was the foundation of our research and recommendations. And so those recommendations morphed into kind of different parts of the bill that we have before us today. So particularly the land management plans and community engagement obligations, the prior notification of sale, and transfer test and lotting are all things that draw very much from the Commission's work and research and our recommendations. And I'll talk through some of these tonight. Also worth noting that the land reform bill is in two parts. Part two is very much around agricultural holdings, changes to leases, new model leases, and reform of smallholders legislation. I'm not going to speak about that tonight, but there is kind of information elsewhere on that for people who are interested in following up. So moving on particularly to land management plans and community engagement, first of all, the details within the land management plans themselves will still need to be confirmed, but the principle is there in the bill and would be established in legislation essentially for large landowners, so those that own, as it stands, 3,000 hectares or more, to produce a land management plan, and as part of that process of production to engage with the community in its development. Those management plans themselves will be available in the public domain, so again providing that kind of source of transparency around what the landowners' ambitions are, what their intentions are over a 5-year period, and then that's repeated every 5 years. Of course, there are kind of incentives to encourage landowners to do land management plans and community engagement, and if they fail to do so, there is the ability for a certain class of bodies to report breaches to the Commission to ensure that those obligations are enforced. So that's the likes of local authorities, other public bodies like NatureScot, for example, would also be able to play a scrutiny role in land management plans. Of course, these are, as a statutory mechanism, only apply to a kind of section of land ownership within Scotland, and therefore good practice remains important. So what Hamish was mentioning earlier, the work of our good practice team and the protocols and the work that they do will still remain hugely relevant for other landowners within Scotland. So turning to prior notification or pre-notification of sale, this will hopefully allow a bit more access and participation within the land market. Essentially what we've seen kind of over the last wee while has been a kind of real pace of activity in the land market, where kind of very few people have been able to participate. And essentially what this will do will pause sales for 30 days. They will all have to be notified to ministers as it stands, and this is any and all sales of 1,000 hectares or more, or also any and all sales from holdings that are 1,000 hectares or more. So if you have an estate that's 1,000 plus hectares and you're selling anything out from that, that would all be notified to ministers as it stands. Ministers themselves will compile a register of parties who are perhaps interested in knowing when that land comes onto market, and that is an entirely open register. This is not a community-focused register. Any individual, local business, farmers, whoever is interested in perhaps acquiring land, should it ever come onto the market, can register their interest. So it's open to all. In terms of communities, though, there is an extended opportunity for community right to buy, an additional 40 days on top of the original 30 that the sale is paused for, is available to specific community groups that are compliant with the CRTB legislation, community right to buy legislation, to develop a sale, to develop a proposal to acquire, to exercise their rights to buy, essentially. Now, this is, again, quite a complex route, and it's worth noting that the Commission's own recommendations around pre-notification, so very much in line with the principle, but perhaps suggesting a more kind of slightly simplified process akin to planning notices, for example. So rather than having perhaps a register that ministers have to maintain when land comes onto the market, it might be simpler to advertise that through local media to the community council, in a similar way that the development planning is done. So strong on principle, I think slight differences in perhaps the way the Commission might see things, but all good in the round. Moving on to the transfer test and lotting, this is probably the chunkier intervention in the bill at the moment. Essentially, what this will do is place a prohibition on qualifying land. So again, land that is over 1,000 hectares that comes onto the market. There will also be, in terms of anti-avoidance, a monitoring process for sales of 50 hectares or more, just to ensure that obviously people aren't selling 999 hectares in multiple different lots to sneak under that threshold. So that would be monitored. Where land qualifies, there will be a kind of assessment by the Land and Communities Commissioner, who will be a new commissioner within the Land Commission, to assess issues of community sustainability. And that report will then go to ministers to make a decision on whether those issues would be best addressed by lotting land, by essentially making that, almost breaking up that estate into lots that would support or further support community sustainability in that local area. Ultimately, this will be a minister's decision. If sell, there is the opportunity to review that decision after a year, and ministers themselves have the ability to buy those lots and add them to the public land holdings as well, whether that's the Forest Estate or through Nature Scot or another public body. So quite a flexible route in there in terms of review. And I think in terms of what the Commission does and the role of the Commissioner, a lot of that is still up for grabs in terms of the decision making and the information that's included there. What I would note, though, is again, this is in principle very much aligned with the Commission's recommendation and evidence. In practice, it does differ from our original recommendations for a public interest test. However, there are perfectly good reasons for that we can perhaps get into in kind of the questions and discussion. But essentially, we are, I think, still working on how we can ensure that this transfer test and lotting process works to the best of its ambition as set out by ministers. And I think at that point, I will turn back to Hamish, who can give a view of things beyond the land reform bill itself, because land reform is not just about the primary legislation. There's a lot of other things going on.
Thanks, James. So just before we open it up to questions, I'll touch just on some of the wider things looking beyond the bill that we're focused on at the moment. And some of the challenges more widely, pretty clearly, I said earlier that community land ownership has become well established, but of course the challenge now is how do we support further expansion of community ownership beyond the 3% of Scotland that it currently covers, and particularly at a time when land sales are moving fast and high prices. And beyond community ownership, how do we open up more opportunities for individuals to own and use small-scale land holdings? Certainly, collaboration with the Crofting Commission on the future development of crofting is part of this, but also looking more widely right across Scotland at different forms of small holdings, small land holdings. And with new value emerging in land from natural capital, very clearly we need to be putting in place the policy framework now for how this value is shared, and particularly how it benefits local economies and communities. And in Scotland's towns and cities, I think we're making good progress collectively in bringing vacant and derelict sites back into use. But again, this remains a big challenge that certainly needs continued momentum and national focus. Next slide, James. So in this context, some of the wider current work that the Commission is doing, as well as advising on the current bill. I've talked earlier about the Good Practice Programme, which will continue to develop, and there's much that can still be done through wider culture change and responsible practice. The Scottish Government has also announced a review of the existing community rights to buy, and we'll be providing advice to inform this, seeking where possible to simplify and strengthen the rights to buy to ensure they remain effective. We also see a big leadership role for public bodies that own land. For example, they're involving communities or responding to the housing challenge, and we want to do more to support opportunities on this. We're refreshing some advice at the moment to government on the way land is taxed and land value is taxed to support the government's work on a tax strategy, and there may be more to come in the next few weeks on that. And we're advising on ways to open up opportunities through different governance approaches for more people to be involved in ownership and decisions about land. Work that I think has real potential for some interesting different approaches. So overall, our work continues to be this mix of providing advice for reforms to law and policy, and supporting practical change on the ground. And I think the connection between those is actually hugely important. So there's lots going on. I think James and I will stop talking now. We would really like to hear from you as well. So let's open it up for some Q&A. We'd welcome questions or observations that you'd like to share. We'll, in a minute, just take the slides down from the screen so that we can see people more easily. Please, if you would like to, please do use the raise hand function. We'd be delighted to hear from you if you'd like to speak and ask a question directly. But if you'd prefer, please also feel free to put questions in the chat function. Now, there's a couple there already that we'll just pick up. Please feel free to raise hands as we're doing this for further questions. There's one, first of all, around accountability that I'll pick up, and there's one there around small holdings and fostering, James, that I'll ask you to pick up in a minute. There's a couple of questions in the chat there about how landowners are held to account for land rights and responsibilities. So I think very helpful question really, and the short answer is that at present there is not a statutory process for holding landowners to account on land rights and responsibilities. It is essentially a matter of good practice, and this is really why we've developed the Good Practice Programme. I think the important thing about this is that it provides a route for accountability. So through the Good Practice Programme, where there are issues in a particular place, there is an ability for whether landowner, community or other individual to make contact with the Commission, to perhaps raise a concern, to share a concern and to seek advice. And it means that we're able to offer some advice to help parties resolve that themselves. But that at the moment is a non-statutory process, albeit quite an important route. As you've seen from James, the Land Reform Bill will bring some change to that, and for landholdings that come in scope of the Land Management Plan obligation, there will be an obligation on landowners for community engagement, with an ability for the Land and Communities Commissioner to investigate potential breaches of that and write a report. So I think that's one area where you can see the Land Reform Bill would introduce strengthened accountability. Briefly, I think there was an add-on to that around the example of Forestry in Scotland and public bodies, and I think it's important just to note that public bodies are absolutely within scope of the land reform measures in exactly the same way as private sector, community sector, NGOs. I think one of the strengths of the land reform approach is that it spans across all sectors of land ownership. James, do you want to pick up the question briefly around property and small land holdings, just to say a wee bit more on that, and then I can see one or two hands up that we'll turn to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think conveniently our colleagues have posted some links to some of the work that we've published recently. So I definitely recommend having a look at that. I think for us, it's also part of the ambition that we've seen right the way back to the beginning, talking of our kind of original evidence base. It's not just about the kind of the issues with large or concentrated land holdings per se. It's also about the ambitions of the people as well. People of Scotland to, have access to land for small holding, for food growing, maybe a forest croft, woodland croft, something of that kind of nature. And again, linking into the Land Reform Bill itself as well, that's one of the potential routes that lotting provides. If there is the ambition to use lotting in that manner to provide options for small holdings, for rural housing, potentially if we're being particularly ambitious to develop entire new crofting townships where that might be appropriate. So a lot of that work is ongoing with my colleague Miranda in particular leading a lot of that, and I watch this space because we've got some stuff in this theme coming out quite shortly, and certainly into next year. We'll have a lot more around this and some really hopefully interesting models and case studies for people to have a look at.
Thanks. Now, Margaret, you'd like to come in with a question. Over to you.
Thank you, Hamish. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah. On you go.
Okay, that's good. Okay, a couple of questions, please. Good words. Now what we need is action and change. First of all, going back to the bill, what opportunities are left for lobbying to get change, or are we at the mercy of what happens in the chamber now? And is there any chance of the bill actually getting some time and going into place? Is it actually on the timetable? Secondly, I wonder if there's been any discussion between yourselves and the Scottish Landform, which is years overdue from reform itself and needs to be looked at very clearly so that it can cope with the modern world of high land prices, biodiversity. I think I taught them how to spell that, but they haven't yet convinced me that they actually know what biodiversity gain is and the importance of it. But so if you could pick up those two things, I'd be grateful. Thank you, Hamish.
Thanks, Margaret. Well, let's just pick up both of those. So in relation to the bill, in terms of timetable, the bill is currently going through the stage 1 process, which is the committee examination. It's the Net Zero Committee in Parliament that is looking at that. It's actually quite a long stage 1 process compared to some bills, and we expect it to run into the new year. So I think the short answer is that it is very much at the stage where a whole range of organisations are giving evidence, being invited by the committee to come forward and give evidence. I think there's another evidence session coming up next week, for example. So, you know, for all the membership bodies and interest groups out there, I've no question that they will still be wanting to make representations into the committee, into Parliament in relation to the bill, and that will go on. For our part, we're working directly with the bill team as well through this process, continuing to provide advice on opportunities we see to make some improvements in relation to simplifying or strengthening some of what's there as well. So I think very much a live and ongoing process in terms of the bill. And I think you make a very good point around the land fund and the need to evolve how that operates. You know, very clearly at a time when land values have gone up so much and the market is acting so quickly, I think absolutely we should be looking together collectively with the land fund, not just at how it operates, but how it can work in conjunction with other sources of finance. I think we are going to have to collectively be quite imaginative in bringing different sources of finance. There's a lot of good work going on in the third sector, particularly through Scottish Communities Finance, for example, bringing together different forms of finance. We do bring that discussion together in some places, including the Community Land Leadership Group, and I think there's certainly more work to do on it.
So there's no actual reform underway or on the horizon. We've just got to keep asking for it.
I don't. Yes, on the one hand, I think we don't need to wait. We can be talking to the Land Fund and all those partners about different and better ways of doing things. I would say the other opportunity that you and others have, of course, is the review that government has announced of community rights to buy. Gives a very clear opportunity to feed into government thoughts and on other aspects that will influence the success of community rights to buy.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Tina, you're looking to come in there as well. Do you want to come in with a question now? Oh, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute still.
I just wondered if you're engaging with Visit Scotland at all, or the Scottish Outdoor Access Network.
We don't have direct engagement with Visit Scotland at the moment. I think in relation to access issues, certainly NatureScot are the lead in terms of public bodies.
Yeah.
We obviously do have some discussion, in particular with landowners and NatureScot, that touches on the relationship between the access code and wider land rights responsibilities. But really that relationship, particularly with Visit Scotland, is probably led through Nature Spot.
Yeah, I need to ask Visit Scotland about that, because this is how they got into trouble with the NC 500. Visit Scotland weren't consulted at all, so I'll have to get Visit Scotland to get in touch with you direct, if that's okay.
Very happy to follow up any specifics around that if it's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. I see a question in the chat, James, around tax and carbon emissions land tax. Perhaps you want to just offer a few thoughts around current work on that.
Yep. So the Commission has done some work previously. I think we would all recognise that the current suite of taxes that touch on property and land and value are not quite working as well as they could do. And I think there is a strong case to make around better taxing of land values, make that clear distinction versus a land value tax or any kind of singular entity like that. But there is definitely value in looking at that. I think in terms of the JMT proposal, I think whether it's for a carbon land tax or any form of land tax, there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. So particularly that kind of infrastructure of mapping Scotland, understanding who the owners are and therefore who is liable to pay the tax. A lot of that work needs to be done because we simply don't have the up-to-date information and data infrastructure there to base any land type tax from, whether that's a carbon tax or any other version. So I think in principle, there's a first step, and this is working towards getting that data infrastructure in place, getting a clear and up-to-date digital record of Scotland's ownership and therefore who's liable, and making sure that transition from particularly the old paper Sasines record, where a lot of land titles and ownership is still described, is brought onto the modern system. So I think once you've done that, and then once we've kind of assessed the value of land as well, again, difficult questions around how land is valued, particularly in the age of natural capital investment. I think those types of traditional uses, the agriculture, forestry, sporting uses of land are well understood, and valuation is quite straightforward. But looking at things like carbon credits in their future, potentially looking towards things like biodiversity credits or whatever might come next, what are the implications for land value if you are then going to be basing a tax on that value? So I think there's a lot of work, groundwork that needs to be done before we leap to a carbon land tax or any other type of land tax. But the principle underlying it is sound. We could definitely do more and do better in taxing land values.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and I see a question popped up in the chat there around the work that Andy Whiteman has done, obviously in mapping land ownership. I think the short answer to the question is absolutely yes, and very happy to recommend that as a very good source of information about land ownership. It doesn't, though, of course, replace the need to actually put that in a statutory public registry footing, which is work, as James says, that is still ongoing and needed. Good. Well, I think we're going to move shortly just to kind of a final quick look ahead at things before we wrap up. So really a chance just for any final questions, if there's anything else that you want to raise just now before we move on. Tina, your hand's up there. Is that you looking to come back in again?
Yeah, that's mine. I just wanted to endorse that, because it's a brilliant idea to have this mapping system. But also we have to make sure that the money actually stays in Scotland and doesn't disappear off down south like everything else. We have to make sure that happens right from the beginning and not let it drift forward. That is the most important thing. If we're going to do all this work and then give it to England, that's not going to happen. Thank you.
Yes, and in a wider context, a big focus over the last kind of 18 months for us has been community benefit, particularly from natural capital investment. We've published guidance last year on practical ways to actually put in place structured community benefit arrangements between project developers, landowners and communities. There is obviously some experience of that in the renewables sector, but actually we need to be much more ambitious in the way that we think about community benefit and the way that we ensure value is retained and reinvested locally in economies. So yes, I think you've put your finger on something that will continue to be a big focus for us and probably many others over the next year or two. Good. Well, it's nearly time for us to wrap up in 5 minutes. So before we do, James, can I just hand back to you with a couple of final slides, just to flag some of the things that are coming up and a bit more information about the webinar series.
Yep, I've lost my slides again, but yes. So I think everything that we've mentioned tonight, or certainly the majority of it, you will be able to find more information on our website. But we've also got some interesting things coming up, particularly on international experience around natural resource governance, I think being published next week. And for those who are close followers of the Commission as well, you'll be familiar with our land markets reporting, which we've been doing on an annual basis for the last couple of years. The next version of the data report will be coming out probably mid towards the end of November as well. So again, giving a kind of numbers to the sales, the locations in Scotland, the values, having putting some of that detail behind what's been going on in Scotland's land market. So certainly a few things coming up to keep an eye on. I think we're also asking you now to few minutes to share some feedback. Obviously, this is the first in a new series of webinars that the Commission is putting on. So grateful for any kind of feedback at this stage. And I will just also give you a wee hint that, or we look at what's coming up. We've got a few different kind of more good practice focused webinars over the next couple of months, starting with the what land rights and responsibilities in Scotland are, and a guide for everyone, and that'll be in a couple of weeks on the 12th of November. Sign up for that, and of course any of the others on that list is via Eventbrite, so the same way you got to this one. And I think that's probably where I will finish my bits for this evening and hand back to Hamish for a final word.
Thanks, James. Yep. So please do have a look at the webinar series coming up, and feel free to sign up to any or all of the events that are coming on. So final thing, just for me to bring things to a close. Thank you very much to everyone for joining this evening. I think it's been really good to have a good mix of people here and to see so many of you joining us. As I say, please do join for some of the more specific webinar sessions that are coming up over the next few weeks. But also please feel free to get in touch if there's something that we've raised or touched on tonight that you'd like to find out a bit more about, or just have questions that you would like to follow up with us. All our contact details can be found on the website, and we'd be delighted to hear from you and very happy to chat further. So thank you very much all. It remains for me just now to say good night, and thank you for joining. We'll close the webinar just now. Thank you.